Canada's booze ban is hitting American makers hard and fast. According to the Wall Street Journal, Canadian provinces have stopped ordering U.S.-made spirits, wine, and beer after a trade battle sparked earlier this year by President Trump's tariffs.
Inside the LCBO, the American whiskeys, the Kentucky bourbons that Premier Doug Ford has really honed in on, California wines, any U.S. ready-to-drink cocktails gone from the shelves. That's 3,600 products from 35 U.S. states no longer available.
We have pallets of product that was bottled and designated for Canada that are sitting in our warehouse.
Inside
Something unexpected is unfolding between the United States and Canada, a quiet but powerful collapse that began not in corporate boardrooms, but in liquor stores. In just one quarter, U.S. spirit exports to Canada plunged by an astonishing 85%, dropping below $10 million. That's the lowest level in the modern history of trade between the two countries. Shelves that once proudly displayed Jack Daniels and Jim Beam now sit half empty or stocked with Canadian brands instead. Across Canada's provinces, retail sales of American liquor have cratered, down more than 66% in only 8 weeks. In Ontario, the country's largest alcohol market, sales of bourbon and whiskey have fallen by 80% since April. Even other categories haven't been spared. Vodka down 14%, whiskey down 13%, brandy down 12%. Analysts are calling it a new kind of prohibition, but this time, it's not law enforcement pulling bottles off the shelves. It's ordinary consumers that echo what triggered this dramatic unraveling of one of the world's closest trade relationships. It all began with a few words. On September 30th, 2025, during a closed-door meeting with U.S. military officials, Donald Trump reportedly repeated a phrase he'd used years before: Canada should be the 51st state of America. What might have been brushed off as a joke in Washington landed like an insult in Ottawa. Just days earlier, Trump had met with Prime Minister Mark Carney, where he remarked that there was a natural conflict between the two nations, but that Canada would walk away very happy. The reaction in Canada was immediate and fierce. Within 72 hours, clips of Trump's remark went viral on social media, gathering over 8 million shares and sparking the hashtag #BuyCanadianOnly. Politicians across party lines, from liberals to conservatives, condemned the statement as an affront to Canadian sovereignty. For a country where trade has always been tightly woven into national identity, those few words were enough to ignite a wave of defiance. American products, once symbols of cross-border partnership, suddenly came to represent condescension. And the first casualty was a product that had long connected the two nations. American whiskey, what began as a social media backlash, quickly turned into a coordinated movement with real economic consequences. Within weeks, the outrage leaped from consumers to policymakers. Provincial governments stopped merely observing the boycott. They began enforcing it. Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick instructed their publicly owned liquor control boards, the LCBO and SAQ, to remove American products from their shelves. What started as a gesture of consumer frustration evolved into an official stance of economic protest. Even as Ottawa quietly lifted its retaliatory tariffs that September, the provinces refused to follow suit. Their reasoning was no longer economic. It was emotional, rooted in pride. Officials described their continued restrictions not as trade barriers, but as symbolic responses to disrespect. Only Alberta and Saskatchewan broke ranks, continuing to allow U.S. imports. They were swiftly criticized for betraying what others called a moment of national unity. The hospitality industry soon followed suit. Bars and restaurants across the country voluntarily removed American spirits from their menus, even at the cost of losing up to 40% of their beverage revenues. In Quebec, major supermarket chains replaced American whiskey with Canadian brands like Crown Royal and Forty Creek, promoting it as an act of economic patriotism. By late spring, a viral slogan had evolved into something much larger, a countrywide stance that blurred the line between consumer choice and public policy. But just as the movement seemed to embody a new sense of Canadian solidarity, irony struck. In February 2026, Diageo, the multinational parent company of Crown Royal, announced plans to shut down its bottling plant in Amherstburg, Ontario. Nearly 200 unionized workers were set to lose their jobs. For many Canadians, it was a bitter twist. The very brand that had become a symbol of economic pride was now outsourcing work away from people who had supported it. What started as outrage over an offhand political remark had spiraled into a full-blown shift in trade behavior, reshaping markets and testing loyalties. The boycott of American liquor revealed something deeper than consumer anger. It exposed the fragility of even the strongest alliances. It showed how quickly national pride can turn into economic force, and how one sentence, spoken behind closed doors, can ripple through industries and economies on both sides of the border. In the end, this wasn't just about whiskey or trade. It was about identity, about who controls a narrative in an era where public sentiment spreads faster than any policy can contain it. And in that clash of pride and politics, the bottle became more than just a drink. It became a symbol of defiance, poured one glass at a time. What began as a simple case of corporate restructuring quickly escalated into one of the most politically charged moments in Canada's recent trade history, when Diageo, the parent company of Crown Royal, announced plans to move its bottling operations from Ontario to the United States. It didn't just trigger layoffs, it ignited outrage. Ontario Premier Doug Ford made global headlines when he dramatically poured out a bottle of Crown Royal on camera, declaring, "This is what I think of betrayal." The gesture struck a nerve. The Ontario government warned that the move could jeopardize more than $740 million Canadian dollars in annual revenue tied to provincial contracts with Diageo, while the labor union Unifor accused the company of bowing to political pressure from Washington. Many saw the decision as an indirect result of Donald Trump's renewed push for Made in America manufacturing, an agenda that, it now seemed, had reached across the border. Public anger spread like wildfire. Across Ontario and Quebec, calls grew to pull all Diageo products, from Johnnie Walker to Guinness, from provincial liquor store shelves. The company, once celebrated as a champion of Canadian craftsmanship, was suddenly recast as a symbol of corporate abandonment. For many Canadians, it felt like a betrayal not only of workers but of national pride. In a twist few had predicted, the very brand that had benefited most from Canada's boycott of American whiskey was now the next target of its own wave of economic nationalism. It was proof that in a trade war built on pride and perception, no company and no country remains untouchable for long. By this stage, both sides of the border had dug in their heels. Each government claimed to be defending its economic sovereignty, but both were suffering deep wounds in the process. In the first half of 2025, U.S. spirit exports to Canada plunged by 62%, dealing a direct hit to distillers across Kentucky and Tennessee, the heartland of American whiskey production. In Kentucky alone, which produces over 95% of the world's bourbon, thousands of barrels now sit unsold in warehouses. Distilleries that once relied heavily on Canadian demand are cutting production, threatening jobs in a region that built its identity around the industry. The impact has been especially severe for Brown-Forman, the maker of Jack Daniel's, which reported a 60% drop in Canadian sales. For the first time in years, the company has been forced to scale back production. Economists warn that the fallout won't stop there. The slowdown is beginning to ripple outward, hitting U.S. grain suppliers, trucking firms, and packaging plants that all depend on the whiskey trade. What started as political backlash over a few careless words has become an economic shockwave reaching deep into America's rural economy. But Canada hasn't escaped the damage either. Diageo's decision to move operations south has left a vacuum. More than 500 Canadian workers in bottling, transport, and logistics now face an uncertain future. Local governments are bracing for declines in tax revenue and a slowdown in export activity from what was once one of Canada's most celebrated industries. The backlash against Diageo may have united Canadians emotionally, but it also revealed the fragility of a system where jobs and national pride are intertwined. Trade experts now describe the standoff as a symbolic war with no real winner. Both nations insist they are asserting independence, yet each is quietly bleeding from the same wound. The collapse in whiskey exports has exposed just how intertwined the two economies remain, and how vulnerable that relationship can be when trust gives way to politics. What began as a minor trade dispute over liquor has evolved into a stress test for the foundation of U.S.-Canada economic ties. The whiskey boycott, once dismissed as a short-lived social media protest, has become a case study in how public sentiment can reshape trade faster than any government policy. Anxiety is spreading far beyond the alcohol industry. From Midwestern soybean farmers to auto plants in Michigan, producers are beginning to fear a chain reaction, a broader consumer boycott among Canadians who are growing increasingly wary of buying American products. Trade groups are warning that the $900 billion in annual commerce that flows between the two nations could be at risk as public trust quietly erodes. Border states like Michigan and New York have urged Washington to ease tensions, fearing long-term damage to industries that depend on Canadian demand. Meanwhile, European and other international brands have seized the moment. Irish and Scottish producers like Jameson and Glenfiddich have rushed to fill empty shelves, boosting their Canadian sales by as much as 40%. What was once a temporary dip in U.S. exports is now looking more like a permanent shift in consumer behavior, a strategic realignment of Canada's liquor market that could endure for years to eye in the end. This story is about far more than whiskey. It's about identity, power, and the price of pride. Both nations say they are standing up for their principles. Canada insists it won't bow to political bullying, while the U.S. champions a vision of patriotic manufacturing designed to bring jobs back home. Yet beneath those slogans, the economic reality tells a different story, one of mutual loss. Canadian firms face layoffs, shrinking contracts, and reputational damage. American distillers are watching their most stable export market collapse. Trade analysts now warn that if anti-U.S. sentiment in Canada continues, American spirit exports could fall below 25% of pre-pandemic levels, permanently reshaping an industry that once thrived on cross-border harmony. But the implications reach even further. Beneath the surface of the whiskey dispute lies a deeper concern, the quiet erosion of the open border model that has defined North American cooperation for decades. What happens when emotion, not economics, starts to drive policy and consumption? Perhaps the real question isn't who wins this trade war, but what it reveals about the future of U.S.-Canada relations. Trade conflicts usually start with policies, but they endure through perception. Once trust is broken, even allies begin to view each other through the lens of rivalry. The rift between these two neighbors, sparked by something as ordinary as a bottle of whiskey, may fade with time, or it may mark the beginning of a lasting realignment, one that reshapes not just trade, but the very way North America defines its unity.